To finish off Chapter 9, we're going to talk about knowledge, expertise, and wisdom. Now, we've already talked a little bit about experts, especially as compared to novices when we were talking about problem solving. So we can refresh on that, where experts have a large number of schemas to help guide their problem solving in their field. So these schemas are sort of their shortcuts, these mental tricks to help them solve problems that they have encountered in the past, things that they've experienced before. And because experts have more experience, they're a lot better than novices at applying these schemas. So through their experience, they've developed more schemas, and they become better at applying those schemas over time. As people become experts, we can say that they're obtaining expertise. This expertise can actually be seen in changes in their brains. They actually have feature detectors, which you'll sometimes see called expert neurons. So parts of the brain will learn to respond to very particular situations. So these feature detectors in the brain become quicker and stronger. They're going to respond to very specific scenarios and help you recognize things quicker. Effectively, you are developing these hard lines for your mental shortcuts. A great example of an expert versus a novice would be people who play chess. So someone new to chess might have to struggle and think about, what do each of these pieces do? How do they move? What else is on the board, and how do those things move? Whereas an expert can have lots of schemas that help them recognize what pieces are on the board and what moves can happen pretty much automatically. In terms of expertise, a experienced chess player would have parts of their brain that would light up and let them know that certain moves are available to them, certain setups are available, certain strings of actions could happen, just because their brains have become wired to look at chess pieces and understand what comes next. They have schemas for playing chess. And we can talk about our schemas, our sort of mental frameworks, those shortcuts that we can form. We can talk about them as scripts, things that you can run to help you achieve a certain outcome. And we've said experts are going to develop many schemas, specifically in the area that they have experience in. And in our everyday life, we can combine our schemas, the things that we have experience with, our knowledge and our ways of problem solving. We can put it all together and help form what's called wisdom. Though wisdom is a little bit of an abstract concept, so we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But we can call wisdom for now a system of knowledge about how we conduct life, perhaps even about the meaning of life. And so if that's not a vague psychology type definition, then I don't know what is. But we can talk about what wisdom is and what it means to each of us. But it's going to differ pretty dramatically depending on our own experiences and even things like culture. Now, the textbook takes a moment to delve into this cultural interpretation of what wisdom might be, to talk about the fact that many cultures, including the Inuit living in the Arctic area of Western Canada, some of these cultures are going to hold their elders as a particular point of respect. So they respect their elders and view them as wise. And when asked to define wisdom, some individuals referred to the fact that wisdom is going to talk about your ability to function as sort of a holder or a knowledge base of your cultural experience, the cultural knowledge. So the fact that you are part of a community and that you have knowledge of this culture and you share knowledge of this culture, that is part of wisdom. So your involvement in your community by teaching the young people those things that you know, that constitutes wisdom. Now, other cultures and other individuals will have different views on what wisdom is. And actually, when you start looking at it, wisdom is a fairly recent thing for psychology to look into. So we don't touch too much on it in this course quite yet because a lot of psychologists haven't really started talking about wisdom. So we can talk about it in sort of vague terms, but this might be an area of future research if this is something that interests you. So if we can talk vaguely about what wisdom might be and what some people might think that wisdom could be, one of the views is that wisdom comes up with sort of 5 central principles or 5 major components. So wisdom can include factual knowledge about life. So things that you know about human nature, about social relationships and life events. So having that knowledge is part of having wisdom. Wisdom can also be made up of procedural knowledge about life. So not just knowing the existence of certain things, but also having strategies, procedures, ways that you can make decisions, handle conflicts, giving advice. That application of these different bits of knowledge can also be wisdom. Wisdom can also involve understanding lifespan contexts, which is basically a fancy way of saying that our lives are made up of sort of different areas. We can have friends, family, work, leisure, and all of these contexts, all of these sort of separate pieces of our life can all interact in unique ways. Wisdom comes with awareness of relativism of values and priorities. So not only do you know your own values and priorities, but you have an understanding that other people might have different values and priorities than your own. And for the last point, wisdom comes with the ability to recognize and manage uncertainty. So basically you're aware that the future isn't entirely known. And so from all of these points, you come up with this idea that expertise, having that experience, can help you have wisdom. There's lots of overlap between being an expert, gaining expertise, and then also gaining wisdom. But wisdom in and of itself seems to be its own thing as well. And of course, when it comes to describing these psychological concepts, it's still a little bit vague, and we're not quite sure where to draw the line between some of these concepts. But that's the view of wisdom that we're discussing for this course. So we'll stop wandering around this topic here because we don't have too much more that we can go into, and we'll move on to our next section, which is where we get into mental imagery. So this is going to be a little bit of a dramatic shift from all of our conversations about thought and logic and moving into wisdom after expertise. But mental imagery can kind of itself be involved in some of our logic and reasoning, because we can use mental imagery and holding sort of visual cues in our minds to solve problems as well. But in this case, when we're talking specifically about mental imagery, we're talking about images that originate from within our brain. So if I ask you to think about a particular shape or imagine what this would look like. So it's not based on an external stimulus. I'm not showing you something and then that's the extent of it. With mental imagery, there's usually, some kind of internal procedure involved. So one of the things that we want to talk about is mental rotation, which is when you have these mental images and you can start manipulating them inside your mind. So if you've ever taken, say, an IQ test, or even a lot of math puzzles will give you some of these things, and they'll give you these odd shapes, and they'll ask you, what is a correct rotation of this shape? So if we look on the side here, is this shape on the left the same as this shape on the right? is that rotation the same three-dimensional shape? Are we just looking at it from a different angle? And then this one here, the one on the left, is that the same as the one on the right? And so on and so forth. And so these, the ability to mentally rotate these things can be used as a measure of intelligence, which is why you'll sometimes encounter them on IQ tests. But if we look at this graph over here, this is a graph looking at if you show these shapes to someone and ask them, is the left the same as the right? This is a graph of how long it takes them to figure out if it's the same shape. And so across the bottom, we have the degree of rotation. So how far away is this, or has the shape been rotated? And then up here is just how long it takes people to say that, yes, they are the same. So this only applies actually to the first two of these, which are in fact rotations of the same shape. So if you have exactly the same image, if they are not rotated at all, you can right off the bat tell that it's the same thing. You can say same right off the bat. But the more rotation there is, the more you have to adjust or change that perception. The more it's rotated and different looking, the longer it takes people to decide that it's the same. So the stronger that angle of rotation, the longer it takes you to figure out if it's the same or not. And that's basically because in your mind's eye, you would take this shape here and sort of flip it and rotate it to see if it lines up with this. So we would twist this one over to see, does it line up? That mental rotation takes us some time to figure it out. And from the way I've been talking here, you might have figured out that these two shapes here are actually not the same shape. And it would take us almost longer to figure out that they're not the same shape, because you start by saying, are they the same? Let's see if they line up. And it takes you a little bit to make sure that they don't line up. So it can take even longer to say no if they're close, like this one. And so, of course, it wouldn't be psychology if there wasn't some disagreement on the nature of these mental images. Some people think that we interpret mental images as actual images. Some researchers say that we store these ideas as language, so a description. So if we looked at this map over here, some people are saying that you would just hold in your mind the picture of a well. Or maybe you're going to hold in your mind the word well or the concept of a well. And there isn't necessarily agreement as to whether we're holding images themselves or concepts or a linguistic description of those images in our mind, and it might actually differ depending on the individual. As I said earlier in this chapter, there's some new evidence that not everyone has that mental internal voice, that running dialogue. So maybe different people have different interpretations of mental images as well. And so testing whether we have sort of this image representation versus a more language-based representation, this testing can involve things like spatial representations. So look at this map and remember where these landmarks are. You could then be asked to conduct a visual scanning task. So I could say, so look at this map, remember where everything is, now close your eyes and imagine that you're looking from the well to the tree. How about from the tree up to this hill? How about from the well to the house? And if you're having sort of an image, a mental image, if it's equivalent to seeing something physical in the real world, you would expect that looking between two things that are close together should take you a lot less time than looking between two things that are further apart. And so there are studies like the one using this map that did find that when we are mentally scanning within our mind's eye using this mental imagery, we will take longer to trace this route in our mind because it's closer than it would take to trace this longer route. And so it seems that, yeah, there is some evidence that we can store these bits of information as images. Now back to the other side of things, where we're viewing these mental image or this mental imagery as closer to language than to actual visual things. Some researchers would say that if you're asked to imagine something like a brick wall, you're not just going into your memory and retrieving an image of a brick wall. Maybe you're actually thinking of those concepts. You're using linguistic concepts that are going to form prepositions. So if you think of brick, things that are stuck together, the mortar, stacking, vertical, making a spreading wall, all of those concepts coming together. As opposed to just a visual image, you're also thinking of the linguistic concepts that describe the thing that you're being asked to think about. And so it seems to be a little bit of both. You can see activation in the brain that's going to indicate that different concepts are being used as you're thinking about these different ideas, but we also have that sort of visual center activation as well. And we see that using things like this experiment here, where they have you imagine traveling between these points, and it takes longer, even though it is a mental representation, that there's some evidence for images additionally. So maybe it's not that you either see it as images or you see it as language. You're probably using a little bit of both to get a more cohesive image, a more cohesive idea in your mental image. So not just visual and not just conceptual, but a bit of both. And we'll end on a very psychology appropriate concept, and that's the concept of metacognition. And metacognition is basically awareness of your own cognitive abilities, where you can recognize what you do and don't know. So metacognition would be if you've watched this video and you feel like you understand the concepts that we've talked about, you could critically evaluate, you could sit there and try and remember and walk yourself through all these concepts to check that you actually understand it. You can critically evaluate your own cognitive ability, your own understanding of that concept. And the subsection of metacognition that's referring to is called metacomprehension. So how accurate you are at judging whether you know something or not. We can also have another subcategory called meta-memory. So your awareness and knowledge of your own mental abilities. So if you were given a list of things to remember, you might be able to look at that and go, my memory isn't that good, I won't be able to remember all of that. So you are aware of your own limitations when it comes to memory. So metacognition is us being aware of our own capacity and capability when it comes to things like thinking, comprehending, and remembering things. And like I said, if that isn't a psychology kind of concept, then I don't know what is. But we will leave the chapter here and pick up with chapter 10 next time.